The night before you were born is a night you never remember, and yet it shapes you in ways you can never quite escape. For Marie Antoinette, that night belonged not to her, but to a world already spinning with rules and expectations, a world that had decided long before she could speak what her life would be used for. She was born in Vienna in 1755 into the glittering, disciplined court of the Habsburgs. Outside the palace walls, winter crept across the ground, frost silencing the grass and glazing the rooftops, but inside, the air was warm with music and ceremony. Candles glowed against polished floors, and whispers floated through long corridors like drifting silk. She arrived into a life that was already scripted, as if the ink on her fate had dried before she took her first breath. As a child, she was not yet a queen, not yet a symbol, not yet a name that would echo through revolutions and history books. She was simply Maria Antonia, a little girl with bright eyes, soft golden hair, and a laugh that bounced lightly off marble walls. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was powerful and resolute, a woman who carried an empire on her shoulders and had little time for softness. Yet even an empress is still a mother, and in the hush of private rooms, she watched over her many children like a strategist studying a map, each child a piece to be carefully placed in the great game of European power. To her, Maria Antonia was not only a daughter to love. She was a future alliance, a bridge between empires, a living promise of peace or advantage. In the vast rooms of Schönbrunn Palace, Maria Antonia grew among brothers and sisters, a small figure darting through spaces that seemed far too grand for childhood. She played in gardens clipped into perfect shapes, where trees stood in straight lines and fountains spoke in quiet, steady murmurs. Tutors tried to fill her days with lessons, languages, music, religion, the correct posture of a future archduchess. But like so many children, her attention floated away towards simpler joys. The feel of sunlight on her face, the whisper of fabric as she ran, the sound of laughter shared in corners where no one important was watching. She was not the most brilliant pupil, not the most studious, and her schooling often carried the impatience of adults who expected more from a girl with such a destiny. Letters from her mother would later carry a hint of disappointment, as if Maria Antonia was a diamond not yet properly cut. Despite this, there was something about her that drew people in, a certain lightness, a charm that did not come from study or effort, but from the natural warmth of someone who preferred smiles over stern words, music over protocol. Musicians were brought to the palace, and Maria Antonia learned to play the harp and sing. Her voice was not perfect, but it had a softness that made people listen. In those moments, with her fingers moving gently over strings, she could forget the weight of expectation and simply exist, a girl caught in a moment instead of a destiny. Perhaps, deep down, she sensed that these small pockets of happiness were hers alone, that the bigger chapters of her life would belong to others. Outside her world of silk and sunlight, Europe itself felt like a chessboard. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and kings and queens measured their power in treaties and marriages. The 7 Years' War had shaken nations, leaving wounds that could not be fully healed by words alone. Trust was thin. Ambition was thick. For Maria Theresa, mother and empress, the solution lay not just in armies, but in weddings. Her children would be her treaties, their vows quietly sealing what cannons and diplomats could not. And somewhere in those careful calculations, her gaze fell upon France, the glittering kingdom across the Rhine, rich, powerful, and uneasy. France and Austria had once been bitter enemies, but now the winds had changed. The diplomatic revolution, as scholars would later call it, was more than just a phrase for books. It was the slow turning of hearts and grudges, shifting old hatreds into new alliances. To strengthen this fragile peace, a marriage was needed, one that would bind Vienna and Versailles by blood. On the French throne sat King Louis XV, and behind him, waiting in the not-so-distant future, his grandson, the awkward, shy Dauphin, Louis Auguste. He was only a boy, quiet and uncertain, with none of the practiced elegance expected of a future king. But his title was enough. He needed a bride. And somewhere in the bright, echoing halls of Schönbrunn, a young archduchess was being quietly marked for that role. Maria Antonia was still just a child when the whispers began. She heard her name in sentences that felt too heavy for her small shoulders. France, Versailles, Dauphin, Queen. Words that sounded like distant countries and distant futures, not like toys in her hands or songs in her head. Yet, in the adult world, decisions were tightening around her like the careful lacing of a corset. Diplomats wrote letters, ambassadors bowed and smiled, and each exchange carried a little more of her freedom out into the cold air. To the men who negotiated, this was not cruelty, it was politics. It was how the world worked. And to Maria Theresa, it was duty. A mother's love expressed not in warm embraces, but in arranged futures. As she grew older, Maria Antonia was observed more closely. Her appearance, her manners, her talents all became topics of quiet discussion. Was she pretty enough? Graceful enough? Could she charm a court as demanding and glittering as Versailles, where every gesture was watched and every smile was weighed? She was sent to have her teeth straightened by a surgeon, a painful and humiliating process, because in a world as polished as the French court, even the smallest imperfection could become a shadow. Dance masters corrected the way she moved. Music teachers honed her performances, and etiquette tutors smoothed away anything too childish. Piece by piece, the girl from Vienna was being reshaped, not always gently, into someone worthy of a foreign throne. Yet at night, when the lessons ended and the corridors grew quieter, she was still just Maria Antonia, a girl looking up at ceilings painted with clouds, wondering what her own sky would look like. Did she feel fear? Did she sense the distance stretching between who she was and who she was expected to become? We cannot know for certain, but it is easy to imagine a young girl torn between curiosity and sorrow. To leave home is always a kind of little death, even when the destination is a palace. Perhaps she walked the gardens more slowly in those final years, tracing familiar paths with quiet steps, trying to memorize the way the trees bent, the way the fountains whispered. Perhaps she held her sisters a little longer every time they embraced. In letters, her mother spoke of duty and honor, of the grand purpose waiting for her in France. It was a beautiful story, the kind adults tell to make hard things sound noble. She would not simply be a bride, they said. She would be the living symbol of peace, the thread that tied two great nations together. But symbols, no matter how beautiful, are not always treated gently. And the girl at the center of it all could not yet know the cost of carrying a crown so many wanted to admire and so many others would grow to despise. Years seemed to move faster once the path was chosen. By the time she reached her early teens, the decision was all but sealed. The French court had agreed. The Austrian court prepared. And Maria Antonia, barely 14, watched as her childhood began to fold itself away like a dress that no longer fit. There was no dramatic goodbye, No shouted protests recorded in history, only the quiet, steady machinery of power doing what it always had. One morning, she was a daughter of Vienna. Soon, she would belong to France. Imagine her on the eve of her departure, standing by a window, looking out at a city she would soon leave behind. The air is cool. The sky is dimming into shades of blue and silver. Behind her, servants move quietly, packing clothes, jewelry, and objects chosen not by a teenager's heart, but by diplomats' minds. This gown will impress. This jewel will speak of wealth. This ribbon will match the colors of France. Around her, everything is preparation, but inside her, there is only the soft, uncertain fluttering of a girl about to step into a life built by other hands. She does not yet know the sound of the French language spoken all around her like a tide she must learn to float in. She does not yet know the gilded ceilings of Versailles, the mirrors that will one day reflect her every move to a world eager to judge. She does not yet know the coldness that can hide behind courtesy, or the loneliness that can grow in the most crowded of rooms. For now, she knows only that she is leaving, and that once she crosses the border, she will never again be just Maria Antonia of Austria. She will become Marie Antoinette of France. So the first chapter of her life closes not with a shout, but with a quiet turning of a carriage wheel. A girl born into winter light, raised among music and marble, is carried toward a future she did not choose. Outside, the roads stretch long and uncertain. Inside, a young heart beats a little faster, poised between childhood and the shimmering, fragile dream of queenship. And as the night deepens around her, history waits, patient and silent, for the moment when this girl will step out of the shadows and into the blinding light of a world that expects everything from her and offers her almost no time to learn who she really is. The palace in Vienna was a world of lessons, of posture and poise, of music and language, and the careful art of being watched. Maria Antonia's childhood unfolded beneath chandeliers and painted ceilings, but like any child, she was drawn less to the rules and more to the secret corners where rules grew softer. She loved music more than duty, games more than etiquette. Tutors complained that her handwriting was poor, that her French was not as refined as it should be, that her mind wandered like sunlight on a river. Yet, when she laughed, the room loosened a little. She was not born with the gravity of a queen. She carried instead an air of lightness, of play, of a girl who still believed the world might bend toward joy. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was not light at all. She was a mountain of will, a woman who carried an empire on her shoulders and her children like pieces on a careful political board. To the Empress, Maria Antonia was not just a daughter. She was a bridge waiting to be built, a bond waiting to be sealed, a key that might unlock peace between Austria and its rivals. In quiet rooms and behind closed doors, while Maria Antonia played and laughed and mispronounced her French verbs, the adults were speaking of alliances, of enemies, of borders drawn in ink and blood. The child's future was being shaped like a dress on a tailor's table, measured and cut without her consent. Still, in those early years, there were soft things. Summer gardens heavy with roses, the sound of a harp in the late afternoon. Sisters whispering stories after the candles had been blown out, trading secrets in the darkness. She loved her small dog, the way its little body warmed her lap when she curled into a chair. She loved the taste of pastries in the morning, the dusting of sugar like fresh snow on her fingers. In these moments, Marie was not a treaty, not a promise, not an emblem. She was just a girl learning to braid her hair, to dance a simple step, to smile when spoken to, never quite aware how closely she was being watched. But as she grew, the world around her began to press in. Reports reached Vienna of France and its young Dauphin, the boy who would one day be king. The French court, with its towering fashion and tangled politics, glittered in stories like a distant, dangerous star. The Empress listened to her advisors speak of Bourbon and Habsburg, of an old rivalry that might be healed by something as delicate and as heavy as a marriage. Maria Antonia, still clumsy in her lessons, did not fully understand what it meant, only that the word France began to appear more often in her mother's letters, her conversations, her gaze. Tutors were changed. New ones arrived with sharper eyes and less patience, sent with a single purpose: to shape this girl into something France might accept. Her hair was brushed and styled in fashions that echoed Paris. Her French lessons grew stricter. The language no longer a simple subject, but a doorway she was required to walk through. Every mistake was a tiny crack in that doorway. Every correction was a reminder that this was not just about education. This was about transformation. Maria Antonia felt it, even if she couldn't name it. The shifting of the ground beneath her feet. The way her laughter seemed less welcome when important visitors were present. The way her mother's affection folded neatly around expectations. She began to understand that her future was not hers in the way she might have hoped. There were no questions like, "What do you want?" There were only statements: "You will," "You must," "You shall." At night, when the palace finally quieted and the steps in the corridor faded into silence, she would lie in her bed and stare up into the darkness. The ceiling above her was invisible, yet she could picture the paintings there, the gods and goddesses frozen in their mythic scenes. She must have wondered what it would be like to be as free as the figures in those stories, to write her own path instead of being carried along on someone else's design. But even those thoughts would have been slippery, half-formed. She was still a child, after all, and the world of adults, with its letters and negotiations and maps, remained a mystery just beyond her fingertips. It was in these gentle, uncertain years that the girl who would become Marie Antoinette first learned the quiet skill of appearing calm while feeling something entirely different inside. She learned to smile when disappointed, to nod when confused, to curtsy when she wanted to run. These were not written lessons, not part of any formal education, but they would become some of the most important tools she carried with her into the future. Outside the walls of Vienna, Europe churned and shifted. Alliances were not carved in marble. They were drawn like chalk on stone, smudged and redrawn whenever power demanded it. In this restless world, Maria Antonia was a small but valuable piece. She did not yet know that her name would soon be changed, that her title would be reshaped, that she would be dressed, polished, and presented to a country that knew nothing of her heart, only of what she represented. For now, she still belonged to Vienna, to the echo of musicians practicing in long halls, to her sister's laughter spilling like light through half-open doors, to the rare, tender moments when her mother's hand rested on her shoulder just a little longer than duty required. But somewhere, perhaps on a night when the wind pressed against the palace windows and the candles flickered low, a quiet decision was made. The child would be offered to France. And the path of her life, like a river meeting a new current, began to turn. The journey from girl to symbol began not with a crown, but with a farewell. By the time Maria Antonia was in her early teens, the world around her had already begun to tighten. Diplomats moved like shadows through the palace corridors. Letters crossed borders, carrying words that weighed more than any child's heart should have to bear. Austria and France, once enemies soaked in each other's blood, now reached cautiously for peace. And in the quiet spaces between treaties and promises, a decision was made. The little archduchess from Vienna would become the bride of the Dauphin of France, the boy who would one day be king. She would leave behind her language, her home, her name, and the girl called Maria Antonia would be transformed into Marie Antoinette. She was barely 14. In those final days in Vienna, the air felt different around her. Rooms she had run through as a child suddenly looked like stages she was stepping off of forever. The gardens where she had laughed with her sisters took on a strange, aching beauty, every tree and pathway wrapped in the soft glow of goodbye. Her mother's gaze felt sharper now, less like a mother's and more like an empress measuring the success of a plan. There were hugs, of course, and kisses on the forehead, but also instructions passed like orders. Be charming, please the king, win the court. Do your duty for Austria. You are not just you anymore. You belong to something larger. The girl who loved music and laughter was being asked to become a living promise. On a spring morning in 1770, Maria Antonia left Vienna in a carriage dressed not only in fine fabrics, but in expectation. The wheels turned over the miles between childhood and destiny, and every hoofbeat on the road carried her further away from the familiar sound of German words, her siblings' voices, the echo of her own laughter in bright palace halls. The landscape changed slowly outside her window, forests giving way to open fields, cities becoming softer in the distance. Inside, she sat among carefully chosen companions, each one a reminder that she was rare and precious, but also watched, guided, shaped. As the Austrian entourage rolled closer to the French border, there was a moment planned that was as strange as it was symbolic. On a small island in the middle of the Rhine River, a special pavilion had been built. It was a place of exchange, a border without being one, a stage for transformation. Here, Maria Antonia would be given up by Austria and received by France. Here, the past would be taken from her, piece by piece, and a new future placed gently, but firmly, in its place. The rules for that day were cold and clear. She was to arrive as an Austrian and leave as a Frenchwoman. That meant no Austrian gown, no Austrian jewels, no Austrian attendants. Everything that had touched the life behind her would be stripped away. Even her small belongings, things a young girl might cling to for comfort, would not be allowed to cross. On that island, she would be emptied so that France could fill her. Inside the pavilion, she stepped out of her carriage and into a room prepared like a theatrical scene. There was a sense of ceremony that felt both grand and strangely cruel. Women from the French court waited for her with polite smiles and watchful eyes. On one side, the Austrian party. On the other, the French. In between, the girl who, until that moment, had belonged to both worlds and to neither completely. They took everything. Her gown was removed, every layer carefully peeled away by Austrian hands, as if each stitch carried the weight of home. The fabrics that had once marked her status now became symbols of a country she would no longer be allowed to claim as her own. Her jewelry was unfastened from her skin, one piece after another, until even the smallest trinket that had once felt personal, intimate, was gone. Standing there, she was suddenly just a body between powers. Then the French clothes came. New fabrics, new colors, new textures. A French gown, cut in the fashion of Versailles, was laid upon her shoulders like a gentle but unbreakable chain. Jewels chosen not by her, but for her, were fastened back around her neck and wrists. They gave her back a kind of beauty, but not the kind she owned. This beauty belonged to France. Maria Antonia had been undressed as an Austrian and redressed as Marie Antoinette. Her very name shifted in the air, softened and reshaped by a different language. The syllables that had once been spoken by her siblings, by her tutors, by her mother when she was pleased or disappointed, were gone. In their place was a new sound, a name that would one day be whispered in outrage, shouted in anger, and finally murmured in mourning. But for now, it was simply unfamiliar, like a cloak not yet warmed by the body that wore it. Stepping out of that pavilion, she was met with French air and French eyes. The Austrian attendants, who had watched her grow, who knew the softness of her laugh and the tilt of her head when she did not understand something, were left behind on the other side. In their place, new faces bowed and curtsied, speaking quickly in a French that still slid a little too fast past her ears. She smiled anyway. She had been taught to. The world expected charm, and she had been told that her charm could be as powerful as any weapon. The road to Versailles stretched before her, both literal and invisible. The carriages moved forward again, this time over French soil, and the landscape outside her window seemed to carry a faint edge of strangeness, even though fields were still fields and rivers were still rivers. She watched peasants in the distance, tiny figures bent over the land, the curves of villages, the spires of churches pricking the sky. These were her future subjects, though none of them knew it yet. To them, she was still just a rumor, a distant girl they would likely never see, a name on someone else's lips. As the great palace of Versailles drew near, it appeared not as a building, but as a vision rising slowly from the horizon. Golden, vast, and gleaming in the light, it looked more like a dream than a home. It was a place built not for comfort, but for spectacle. Every window, every statue, every garden walkway told the same story. Here, power lives. Here, the sun once rose and set around the will of a king. Inside the carriage, Marie Antoinette's hands may have tightened just a little in her lap. She had been prepared for this. She had been coached in what to say, how to move, how to bow, how to smile at the right moment. But nothing in Vienna could truly capture the weight of Versailles. It was not just a palace. It was a world within a world, ruled by customs and rituals that seemed almost like a religion. When she arrived, the court was waiting, eyes glittering like the jewels they wore. The king, Louis XV, stood at the center of this carefully arranged universe, wrapped in authority and age. Beside him, or not far from him, was the Dauphin Louis Auguste, the shy, awkward boy who would become her husband. He was only a few years older than she was, yet he seemed somehow more boyish than manly, as if he had not quite grown into his own height or his own destiny. Her first steps into Versailles were the steps of someone being watched from every angle. Every tilt of her head, every curve of her smile, every gesture of her hands was measured, weighed, and quietly judged. She knew it, even if she tried to ignore it. Her future mother-in-law, the aunts of the king, the courtiers whose lives were built around gossip and favor, each one studied her with sharp, experienced eyes. And still she smiled. Somewhere beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, she was still the girl who loved music, who had been scolded for her messy handwriting and dreamy attention. But here, in this place of mirrors and marble, that softness had to find a new way to survive. She was expected to be graceful, elegant, and above all, useful. A wife to the Dauphin, a potential mother to a line of future kings, a living tie between France and Austria. That first night at Versailles, as candles burned in endless rows and the corridors hummed with whispers, Marie Antoinette must have felt the strangest mixture of wonder and loneliness. She had entered a dream that was not her own. She had been given a role in a story she did not write. Outside, under the same sky she had known in Vienna, stars hung quietly over the palace roof. Inside, the girl from Austria was learning how to sleep in a place where every move, even the closing of her eyes, seemed to belong to someone else. And somewhere deep inside her, a quiet question may have started to form, one that would grow louder with time. In a life shaped so carefully by others, how much of herself could she keep? The morning she left Austria, the sky was the color of washed linen, pale and unsure. It was not a grand blue farewell, not a blazing sunrise. It was soft, almost reluctant, as if the heavens themselves were uncertain about letting her go. Maria Antonia, already being called Marie Antoinette in official mouths, stood bundled against the chill, wrapped in fabrics chosen not for comfort, but for appearance. Around her, everything was motion. Hooves striking the earth, carriages shifting, servants calling to one another, guards in glittering uniforms holding their positions with rigid precision. It looked like a celebration of state, but to a 14-year-old girl, it felt like the world being packed away and sealed behind her. Her mother did not weep. Empress Maria Theresa, who had given birth to 16 children and ruled an empire, stood firm. Her eyes were sharp, studying her daughter the way a general studies a boarder. She adjusted a fold of fabric at Maria Antonia's shoulder, straightened a ribbon, smoothed a crease that no one else would have noticed. "Remember," the Empress said, her voice low and firm, "you go not as a child, but as an archduchess, as my daughter, and as the future Queen of France. Your behavior will be watched. Your words will be repeated. Your mistakes will not be forgiven easily." Maria Antonia nodded, but the words fell on a heart that was still trying to understand that this goodbye was not like the others. There would be no familiar footsteps in the corridor tomorrow, no soft knock from a sister asking to borrow a ribbon, no music drifting from the same old rooms. Her mother's stern gaze softened just for a heartbeat. "You must charm them," Maria Theresa added, almost gently. "But do not let yourself be ruled by flattery. Be kind, but not foolish. And above all, remember who you are." Who was she? At that moment, Maria Antonia felt like a name being erased and rewritten all at once. They did not embrace for long. The Empress could not appear weak, not before ministers, not before foreign envoys, not even before her own daughter. But as Maria Antonia stepped away, she carried with her the faint, warm press of her mother's last touch on her cheek, like a seal put on a letter that could never be returned. The journey toward France unfolded in days and nights, in the steady rocking of carriages and the rhythmic clatter of wheels over uneven roads. The world outside the window shifted slowly, Austria fluttering away behind her like a page turned and pressed flat. She traveled with a carefully chosen entourage mates, governesses, attendants, ladies-in-waiting, guards. There were trunks of gowns and jewels, gifts and documents, symbols of peace packed into wooden cases. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when the carriage lantern swung like a sleepy star and the others dozed, Maria Antonia felt something hollow at the center of all that finery. Sometimes she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the countryside blur by in shades of brown and green, fields and distant cottages and forests that did not know who she was, did not care that a future queen was passing through. In those moments, she allowed herself to be only a girl on the road. She thought of her sisters, of games in the corridors, of half-finished songs at the piano. She remembered her father, long gone now, with his gentler patience and quieter presence. She thought of her mother's stern eyes and the weight of the empire that seemed to follow her like a shadow. And then she thought of him, the Dauphin, Louis. She had never seen him. A face constructed from descriptions and rumors, shy, awkward, fond of hunting and locks and keys more than dancing and speeches. A boy being shaped into a king, just as she was being shaped into a queen. Two strangers whose lives had been bound together before they had even exchanged a word. Would he like her? Would he find her foolish, or too young, or too foreign? Would he be cruel? Would he be kind? In the privacy of her thoughts, she asked herself questions she could never say aloud. What if I am not enough? What if I am too much? There is a place where borders are not just lines on maps, but stages for ceremony, an island in the middle of the Rhine, a no man's land between Austria and France. That is where they brought her. On that island, in a specially built pavilion, the transformation was to be completed. One life removed, another laid over it like a mask. The structure rose like a glittering shell in the cold air, draped in fabrics and emblems, half Austrian, half French. One side of it opened to the land she had known, Vienna, her childhood, her language, her family. The other side opened toward the world she was being given to Versailles, the French court, a husband she had never met, a people she did not yet understand. Inside the pavilion, the rules were strict. Every Austrian attendant had to stop at one end. Every French attendant waited at the other. In the middle, Maria Antonia stood alone, the bridge between two nations, and, for a moment, with no country at all. The ritual was simple, but it cut deep. Her Austrian clothes were removed. Every layer of silk and lace, every ribbon and jewel carefully unfastened and taken away, piece by piece, until the girl who stood there was no longer dressed as a daughter of Austria. Even the small things disappeared. A pendant she had been given as a child, a ring one of her sisters had pressed into her hand, a tiny comfort meant to cross the border with her. The French officials were firm. Nothing Austrian could pass into France. She was to begin again, completely. She shivered not from cold alone, but from a sense of being peeled back, stripped not just of fabric, but of herself. Then the French garments arrived, gowns cut in the Parisian style, new jewelry, new shoes, new ribbons. Her hair restyled, powdered, arranged with the careful extravagance the French adored. They addressed her now only in French, calling her Madame la Dauphine, as if speaking the title would press it onto her skin. When they were finished, the girl from Vienna was gone to everyone but herself. In the mirror, Marie Antoinette stared back. Her eyes were the same, wide and uncertain, a little too bright. But around those eyes there were new lines of expectation, new calculations in the faces of those watching her. She was no longer simply a teenage archduchess. She was an offering, a promise, a living treaty wrapped in silk. Outside, trumpets sounded. The doors on the Austrian side closed behind her with a soft, final weight. On the French side, the doors opened. As she stepped out, the air seemed different. Same wind, same river, same pale sky, but everything had shifted. French officers bowed, ladies dipped in graceful curtsies. Flags fluttered with golden lily, the fleurs, lys of Bourbon kings. Vive Madame la Dauphine! Voices called. Marie Antoinette smiled, because that was what she had been taught to do. The smile felt fragile at the edges, like something made of glass. Horsemen waited, carriages gleamed, the journey toward Versailles poised to begin. Somewhere far ahead, in the grand mirrored halls of the most dazzling court in Europe, a shy boy waited who would one day be Louis XVI. But for now, on that island between two worlds, Marie Antoinette stood suspended, a girl who had just walked out of her childhood and onto a path that would lead her into both unimaginable splendor and unimaginable ruin. The crossing was over. The real performance was about to begin. There is a point on the map where Austria ends and France begins, but for Marie Antoinette, that border was more than a line of ink. It was an island, small, bare, and strange, built for the quiet violence of transformation. Protocol demanded it. On a narrow island in the middle of a river, between the lands of her childhood and the future that waited for her, a wooden pavilion had been raised. Its walls were draped in fabric, its floors laid hastily yet carefully, as if elegance could soften what was about to happen. This was the place where she would stop being who she had been, and step quite literally into the role others had written for her. The carriage door opened. Cold air slid in, sharp and damp, carrying the scent of earth and water. Marie Antoinette stepped down, her feet touching Austrian soil for the last time. Around her, Austrian and French officials stood in their respective clusters, divided not just by uniforms, but by posture, by language, by the way each side watched her like a possession being counted. Her Austrian attendants helped her across a small platform, every step clicking faintly like a clock counting down. Inside the pavilion, the world narrowed. The chatter outside dimmed to a muffled hum. The air inside smelled of wood and starch and a faint trace of perfume, as if someone had tried to disguise the anxiety in the room. This was the ritual of the remise, the handing over. By tradition, nothing of Austria was allowed to cross into France with her. No gown, no jewel, no ribbon, not even the linen against her skin. She was to be given to France pure and unmarked, like a diplomatic offering wrapped in protocol. It sounded ceremonial, poetic even, when written in letters and treaties. In reality, it meant this. She had to be stripped. Her Austrian ladies, who had dressed her since childhood, now moved in silence. Their hands trembled slightly as they began to unfasten her gown. Silk loosened, laces slipped, layer by layer of fabric whispering away from her body. The room was cold. Goosebumps rose along her arms. The warmth of their familiar fingers only made it worse. No one spoke her name. They peeled away Austria from her skin, the petticoats, the chemise, the ribbons she had chosen, the small sentimental pieces tucked where protocol did not see. A rosary from a sister, a handkerchief folded neatly with the scent of home. One by one they were taken, placed aside, claimed silently by the rules of empire. For a moment, she stood on the bare floor in nothing but her youth and her fear. On the other side of a thin partition, her new life rustled and waited. French ladies in waiting, appointed by a court that did not yet know her, prepared the garments of a Dauphine of France. The silks were heavier, the colors subtly different, the cut of the bodice sharper. Even the fabric seemed to speak another language. Her Austrian governess, the woman who had scolded and soothed her for years, fixed her with a look that wavered between duty and love. "Remember what you are," she whispered in German, voice soft but firm. "You are an Archduchess of Austria. Do not forget it in France." The words clung to Marie Antoinette like the last invisible garment of her old life. Then, as if on cue, the door on the French side opened. The new attendants entered, women with carefully arranged hair, measured smiles, and eyes that searched her with polite curiosity. They spoke in French fluid, fast, polished. She understood enough to follow, but not enough to feel at home inside the sentences. They dressed her. The French chemise slid over her head, cool and unfamiliar. The stays were pulled tighter than she was used to, reshaping her posture, her breath, her silhouette. Jewels were clasped around her neck, glittering like promises she had never made. The gown settled over, wave upon wave of fabric, heavy with expectation. Bit by bit, they built Marie Antoinette. When they were done, she did not quite recognize the girl in the small polished mirror. The face was hers, but framed in a way that made her look older, less like a child, more like a painting. They had arranged her hair higher, powdered it paler. Her lips had been touched with color. Her eyes, wide with uncertainty, were the only thing no one could disguise. A French lady leaned in, adjusting a final fold of satin. "Votre Altesse, you are perfect," she said gently. "Perfect, finished, presented." Outside, the ceremony resumed. She stepped out of the pavilion and onto French soil for the very first time, her shoes pressing into a land that now claimed her completely. Trumpets sounded. Flags lifted in the wind. Voices called her new name, Vive la Dauphine. Vive Marie Antoinette. The sound washed over her in a wave that was both thrilling and terrifying. She smiled because she had been taught to smile. She tilted her chin because that was how queens-to-be were meant to stand. But somewhere deep inside, there was a small, quiet ache for the girl who had walked into that pavilion and not entirely walked back out. Behind her, the island shrank with every step. Ahead of her stretched France, vast, glittering, unknowable. A country that would one day celebrate her, then resent her, then condemn her. But she could not see that yet. All she could feel was the weight of her gown, the tightness of her stays, and the strange sensation of walking forward in a name that had been chosen for her. Maria Antonia of Austria had been left behind on the river. Marie Antoinette of France crossed onto the shore.